He thought humiliating a quiet woman in front of his wealthy clients would make him look powerful, but within a single afternoon, he would watch millions of dollars disappear from his bank forever. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe people should be judged by their character instead of their appearance, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who still believes kindness matters. The morning sun reflected across the towering glass windows of Sterling National Bank in downtown Chicago, casting long beams of light over polished marble floors and gold-trimmed counters, where some of the city's wealthiest clients handled their private financial affairs. Employees in tailored navy suits moved with rehearsed precision, while soft classical music drifted through the lobby, creating the kind of atmosphere designed to remind everyone inside that money meant status, and status meant power. At exactly 9:12 a.m., Victoria Hale stepped through the revolving doors wearing a cream-colored cardigan, dark jeans, and simple brown flats that had clearly seen years of use. Her blonde hair rested neatly against her shoulders, and she carried a weathered leather folder beneath one arm as she quietly approached the reception desk, without demanding attention from anyone around her. Several clients barely glanced at her before returning to their conversations, but others exchanged subtle looks the moment they noticed her modest appearance against the backdrop of expensive watches, designer handbags, and custom Italian suits. Victoria noticed the stares immediately. She always did. But after years of living quietly despite extraordinary wealth, she had learned not to react when strangers measured her value before hearing her speak. Behind the main counter stood Ethan Carlisle, Sterling National's senior branch manager, a tall man in his late 40s whose perfectly styled silver hair and sharply pressed charcoal suit reflected someone deeply invested in appearances. Ethan prided himself on identifying elite clients within seconds, and over the years, that confidence had slowly evolved into something uglier. Judgment had become instinct. The moment his eyes landed on Victoria, his polite smile weakened almost imperceptibly. He watched her walk across the marble floor with calm, steady steps, and already he had decided exactly who she was. Someone out of place. Someone beneath the atmosphere he worked so carefully to maintain. Victoria approached the counter with a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said softly. "I'm here to discuss transferring funds for the Hale Children's Scholarship Foundation." Ethan's eyes lowered briefly toward her worn leather folder before returning to her face with carefully disguised skepticism. Around them, keyboards clicked softly while nearby clients pretended not to listen. "Of course," Ethan replied, though his tone carried the faint edge of condescension. "And approximately how much are we discussing today?" Victoria opened the folder carefully. "A little over $12 million. For the first time that morning, Ethan Carlisle stopped smiling entirely. The lobby seemed to grow quieter, and somewhere near the back offices, a young employee looked up from his computer with sudden curiosity, sensing that something inside Sterling National Bank was about to go very, very wrong. The number seemed to hang in the air long after Victoria finished speaking. $12 million. Even the soft piano music drifting through the lobby suddenly felt distant beneath the growing tension spreading across Sterling National Bank. Ethan Carlisle stared at the documents inside her folder with narrowed eyes, his polished confidence slipping into visible suspicion. He had spent 20 years working among hedge fund executives, private investors, and corporate attorneys, and in his mind, wealthy people looked a certain way. They arrived with chauffeurs, luxury handbags, and tailored clothing that quietly announced status before a single word was spoken. Victoria Hale did not fit the image he trusted. "The Hale Children's Scholarship Foundation?" Ethan repeated slowly, leaning back slightly as if distancing himself from the paperwork in front of him. "I am not familiar with that organization." Victoria nodded politely. "That is understandable. We operate mostly through direct educational grants across Illinois and Wisconsin." Ethan flipped through the documents with exaggerated care while two nearby associates subtly glanced in their direction. The moment he saw the account figures, His expression changed again, but not into respect, into disbelief. "You are requesting a transfer of $12 million into Sterling National?" he asked. "That is correct," Victoria answered calmly. "The foundation is expanding its scholarship program next semester." Ethan gave a short smile that never reached his eyes. "I see." His gaze drifted once more toward her cardigan, her simple flats, and the worn edges of the leather folder she carried. Then he looked back at the paperwork, as though searching desperately for evidence that would justify the assumptions already forming in his mind. Around them, several clients had begun quietly watching the interaction unfold while pretending to focus on their phones or conversations. A woman wearing a pearl necklace lowered her coffee cup slightly. An older man near the investment offices folded his newspaper halfway down. Human curiosity always moved faster than professionalism. Ethan tapped one manicured finger against the desk. "Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "transactions involving this amount of money require extensive verification procedures." "Of course," Victoria replied. "I brought every document your office requested during yesterday's phone call." Ethan glanced at the paperwork again, but made no effort to review it thoroughly. Instead, he pressed a button beneath the counter. Moments later, a younger employee named Melissa approached with a tablet in hand. "Can you verify these credentials?" Ethan asked loudly enough for nearby clients to hear. Melissa accepted the folder politely, though Victoria noticed the uncertainty in the young woman's expression after hearing the amount involved. Ethan folded his hands together and lowered his voice slightly, though not enough to prevent others from listening. "You understand, we must protect our institution from fraudulent financial activity." Victoria remained composed. "I understand security procedures completely." Ethan tilted his head. "Good, because large financial claims sometimes attract individuals attempting to present themselves as representatives of organizations they are not actually connected to." The implications settled heavily between them. Nearby conversations faded further. One customer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while another discreetly stepped closer to listen. Victoria felt heat rise softly into her cheeks, but her voice never changed. "The foundation has operated legally for 7 years," she said. "Everything you need is in that folder." Ethan smiled again, but this time the condescension became impossible to hide. "I am sure you believe that." The words landed like a slap wrapped in velvet, and somewhere across the marble lobby, a security guard slowly turned his attention toward the front counter, sensing the atmosphere inside Sterling National Bank becoming more dangerous with every passing second. Melissa carefully scanned the documents, while the atmosphere inside Sterling National Bank continued tightening like invisible wire pulled too far. The polished marble lobby, that usually carried the calm confidence of old money, now felt strangely tense beneath the weight of public judgment unfolding in real time. Victoria Hale stood quietly at the counter, with both hands resting gently on her leather folder, while Ethan Carlyle watched her, with the kind of skepticism reserved for people he had already decided did not belong in his world. Melissa's eyes widened slightly as she reviewed the foundation records. "Sir," she said carefully, "the documentation appears legitimate." Ethan barely looked at her. "Appears legitimate is not the same thing as verified." His voice sharpened enough to carry across the nearby waiting area. Several clients openly turned their attention toward the counter now, no longer pretending otherwise. A man near the investment offices removed his glasses entirely. Two women seated beside the coffee station exchanged whispers behind carefully manicured hands. Victoria noticed every stare, every subtle expression, every quiet assumption forming around her appearance. But she remained composed because humiliation was rarely loud at places like Sterling National. It arrived politely, professionally, wrapped inside polished smiles and carefully chosen words. Ethan slowly closed the folder and slid it back toward her without invitation. "Mrs. Hale," Institutions like this operate on relationships and trust, he said. People do not simply walk in off the street claiming control over $12 million. Victoria blinked softly. I never claimed control over it. I represent the foundation managing the transfer. Ethan leaned slightly forward. And yet you arrived without legal counsel, financial advisors, or corporate representation. The implications settled heavily over the counter again. Melissa shifted uncomfortably beside him. Victoria's cheeks warmed, but her voice stayed calm. I have handled the foundation personally for years. Ethan gave a soft laugh beneath his breath. I am sure you have. The condescension in his tone drew visible discomfort from even nearby employees now. A young teller looked down at her keyboard, pretending not to hear, while the security guard near the entrance subtly repositioned himself closer to the lobby. Ethan folded his hands together. Sterling National serves a very specific clientele, he continued. Our clients expect professionalism and discretion. Victoria glanced briefly around the gleaming lobby with its crystal chandeliers and private investment offices lined behind frosted glass walls. Then she looked back at Ethan. Are you suggesting I am unprofessional? Ethan's smile returned, colder this time. I am suggesting appearances matter in financial environments like this one. The room went quiet, truly quiet. Even the soft clicking of keyboards seemed to disappear for a moment beneath the weight of what everyone had just heard. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly toward the folder in front of her. For a second, something painful moved quietly across her face. Not anger, not fear, recognition. She had spent years helping underprivileged children attend schools their families could never afford, while wealthy donors praised her compassion at charity events. Yet strangers still looked at her simple clothing and assumed incompetence before humanity. Ethan mistook her silence for surrender. That was his greatest mistake. He straightened his suit jacket confidently and spoke louder than necessary. Frankly, Mrs. Hale, people handling transactions at this level usually present themselves differently. One of the nearby clients let out an uncomfortable cough. Another customer slowly stood and walked away from the waiting area entirely. Melissa's face flushed red with second-hand embarrassment. But Ethan continued speaking, unaware that every cruel word was pushing Sterling National Bank closer to a disaster none of them were prepared for. And somewhere outside, beyond the towering glass entrance, a black luxury sedan had just quietly pulled up to the curb. Victoria slowly lifted the leather folder from the counter, her movements calm despite the dozens of eyes now fixed on her throughout the lobby. The humiliation had spread beyond Ethan Carlyle's words alone. It lived inside the silence of the employees who refused to intervene, inside the curious glances of wealthy clients who watched her as though she were some uncomfortable disruption to their carefully polished morning routine. Sterling National Bank had become a courtroom without anyone officially putting her on trial. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit and offered a smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. Mrs. Hale, perhaps a smaller regional bank would better suit your needs. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning cut sharply through the marble lobby. One of the older clients near the coffee station frowned visibly now, while Melissa stood frozen beside the counter, holding her tablet against her chest like a shield. Victoria looked directly at Ethan for the first time since the exchange began. Her blue eyes remained steady, though disappointment quietly settled behind them. You still have not answered my question, she said gently. Are you refusing the transfer? Ethan folded his hands together. I am protecting this institution from potential liability. Based on what? Victoria asked. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly because the truth sounded ugly when spoken aloud. Based on her clothes. Based on the absence of diamonds around her wrists. Based on the fact that she walked into a multi-million-dollar bank transaction looking more like a school teacher than the wife of one of the wealthiest investment executives in Illinois. But Ethan could not say any of that directly, so instead he hid behind polished corporate language. People conducting financial business at this level generally arrive with professional representation, he said. Not alone. Victoria nodded faintly, almost sadly. I see. Ethan mistook her quietness for defeat again. He gestured lightly toward the entrance. I believe it would be best if you returned another day with appropriate documentation and legal counsel. Melissa inhaled sharply beside him because she knew perfectly well the documentation had already been verified. The room had gone almost completely silent now. Even clients waiting near the private banking offices openly watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. A younger teller lowered her eyes entirely, ashamed of what was happening in front of everyone. Victoria carefully closed the folder and held it against her chest. You know, she said softly, I used to believe financial institutions cared about integrity. Ethan forced a small laugh. Integrity requires caution, Mrs. Hale. No, Victoria replied quietly. Integrity requires fairness. The sentence lingered heavily between them. Ethan's confident expression hardened instantly. He was no longer simply questioning her legitimacy. Now he felt challenged, and people like Ethan Carlisle protected their pride more aggressively than their ethics. He straightened his posture and raised his voice just enough for nearby clients to hear clearly. Sterling National reserves the right to refuse service when circumstances appear suspicious. The accusations settled over the lobby like smoke. A hush fell across the bank. Victoria's face paled slightly as several customers exchanged uneasy glances. One woman near the waiting area whispered something under her breath, while another customer slowly shook his head in disbelief. Melissa looked horrified. Ethan had crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the massive glass entrance doors quietly swung open behind her. A tall man stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored black overcoat over a navy suit that probably cost more than most monthly salaries inside the building. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Even before anyone recognized him, his presence alone changed the atmosphere. The security guard near the entrance straightened immediately. Two senior associates near the investment offices exchanged nervous looks. And when Ethan Carlisle finally lifted his eyes toward the man walking across the marble floor, the color slowly drained from his face. Jonathan Hale crossed the marble lobby with calm, measured steps that immediately transformed the atmosphere inside Sterling National Bank. He did not move like someone trying to impress the room. He moved like someone entirely accustomed to owning it. His dark navy suit fit perfectly beneath the long black overcoat draped across his shoulders, and the silver watch visible beneath his cuff reflected softly under the crystal chandeliers above. But it was not the expensive clothing that changed the energy inside the bank. It was recognition. One senior associate near the private investment offices suddenly straightened so fast that his chair rolled backward into the wall behind him. Another employee whispered under his breath, "That is Jonathan Hale." The name spread quietly through the lobby in seconds. Clients who moments earlier had watched Victoria with suspicion now exchanged stunned looks with one another. Even the security guard near the entrance lowered his eyes respectfully as Jonathan approached the counter where Ethan Carlisle stood frozen beside Victoria. Jonathan stopped beside his wife and immediately noticed the tension in her posture, the faint redness around her eyes, and the folder clutched tightly against her chest. His expression did not change dramatically. That made it worse. Calm anger carried far more weight than shouting ever could. "Victoria," he said gently, "what happened?" Ethan attempted to recover instantly, forcing a strained smile onto his face. "Mr. Hale, welcome back to Sterling National. We were simply handling a verification misunderstanding." Jonathan did not even look at him at first. His attention remained entirely on Victoria. "Are you all right?" Victoria gave the smallest nod. "I am fine." But Jonathan knew his wife too well. He could hear the humiliation hidden carefully beneath her steady voice. For several long seconds, silence filled the marble lobby. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Jonathan slowly turned toward Ethan Carlisle. The branch manager's confidence visibly weakened under the weight of that gaze alone. "You accused my wife of fraudulent activity?" Jonathan asked quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "Not directly, sir. We were following institutional security procedures." Jonathan glanced toward Melissa. The young employee looked trapped between fear and conscience. "Is that accurate?" he asked her calmly. Melissa hesitated only briefly. "No, sir," she admitted softly. "Mrs. Hale provided complete verified documentation." Ethan's face lost what little color remained. A hush fell across the bank. Jonathan looked back at Ethan, and for the first time since entering the building, disappointment appeared in his expression. Not rage, disappointment. Somehow, that felt far colder. "So you humiliated her publicly anyway," Jonathan said. Ethan quickly adjusted his tie with shaking fingers. "Sir, I was only trying to protect the bank." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "From what?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came, because now the truth stood exposed in front of everyone watching. He had not judged Victoria based on evidence. He had judged her because she walked into Sterling National wearing modest clothes instead of luxury labels, because she looked kind instead of powerful, because Ethan Carlisle believed wealth had a uniform. Jonathan slowly removed one hand from the pocket of his overcoat and rested it lightly on the marble counter. "Do you know why my wife dresses simply?" he asked quietly. Ethan said nothing. "Because while people like you spend their lives trying to look important, she spends hers funding schools for children who cannot afford textbooks." The words hit the room with crushing silence. Several clients lowered their eyes immediately. Melissa looked close to tears. Ethan stood motionless, his polished corporate confidence collapsing visibly by the second. Jonathan leaned slightly closer, his voice remaining calm enough to terrify the entire room. "You just publicly humiliated the most decent person I know." And in that moment, everyone inside Sterling National Bank realized they were watching a man decide exactly how much damage he intended to do. No one inside Sterling National Bank moved after Jonathan Hale spoke. The silence hanging across the marble lobby felt heavier than anger itself. Ethan Carlisle stood behind the counter, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had already slipped far beyond his reach. His hands trembled slightly against the polished surface, while nearby employees avoided eye contact entirely. For years, Ethan had built his reputation around confidence, authority, and appearances. But now, every carefully polished layer of arrogance was cracking in front of wealthy clients, junior employees, and the most powerful customer Sterling National had ever managed. Jonathan remained calm beside Victoria, one hand resting gently near hers on the marble counter. That quiet gesture alone revealed more about their marriage than any display of wealth ever could. He protected her without needing to dominate the room. Ethan forced another weak smile. "Mr. Hale, I assure you this situation can be corrected immediately." Jonathan looked at him without expression. "Corrected?" Ethan swallowed hard. "We value your relationship with Sterling National tremendously." Jonathan's gaze drifted slowly across the lobby, toward the private banking offices, the gold-trimmed walls, the clients pretending not to listen while hearing every word. "Interesting," he said quietly, "because your branch manager just informed my wife she does not belong here." Ethan immediately stepped forward. "Sir, that was taken out of context." Melissa closed her eyes briefly because everyone in the room knew exactly what had been said. Jonathan turned toward her again. "How long have you worked here?" Melissa looked startled. "Almost 3 years, sir." "And did my wife behave disrespectfully at any point?" Melissa shook her head softly. "No, sir. She was polite the entire time." Jonathan nodded once. Then he looked back at Ethan Carlisle. "So let me understand this correctly. My wife arrived with verified documentation to transfer $12 million into your institution, and instead of treating her with professionalism, you publicly implied she was dishonest because of the way she dressed." Ethan's face flushed deep red. "Sir, I never intended," Jonathan interrupted him quietly. Intentions matter far less than actions. The words landed with absolute finality. Nearby clients shifted awkwardly while several employees stared at the floor in embarrassment. One older customer slowly folded his newspaper and stood, watching Ethan with visible disappointment. Sterling National suddenly no longer looked like a symbol of prestige. It looked small. Jonathan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed his phone. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Panic began replacing pride. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "perhaps we should continue this discussion privately in my office." Jonathan ignored the suggestion entirely and dialed a number from memory. The room remained silent except for the faint ringing through the speaker. Then a calm voice answered. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. This is Jonathan," he said evenly. "I need every Hale Capital account frozen for transfer out of Sterling National immediately." Ethan froze completely. Several employees exchanged horrified looks. Jonathan continued speaking with frightening calm. "That includes all corporate portfolios, investment holdings, educational trusts, and foundation assets." The voice on the phone hesitated briefly. "Sir, that represents nearly $400 million. "I am aware," Jonathan replied. "Begin the transfer process today." Ethan looked physically ill now. "Mr. Hale, please," he whispered. "There is no need for drastic action." Jonathan slowly lowered the phone from his ear. "You embarrassed my wife in front of this entire bank because she chose kindness over appearance," he said quietly. "Now your institution can explain to its board why $400 million is leaving before lunch." A hush fell across the lobby so complete that even breathing sounded loud. Ethan Carlyle opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. Because for the first time in years, he finally understood the true cost of judging someone by the clothes they wore instead of the character they carried. The moment Jonathan Hale ended the call, the atmosphere inside Sterling National Bank changed from uncomfortable tension to absolute panic. Employees who had spent the last 20 minutes quietly observing now moved frantically behind their desks, whispering into office phones while computer screens lit up across the investment department. Somewhere in the back offices, a senior executive hurried out so quickly he nearly collided with a teller carrying paperwork through the hallway. The reality of what had just happened was spreading through the building faster than anyone could contain it. $400 million. Gone. Ethan Carlyle stood motionless behind the marble counter as though his body had forgotten how to function. Only minutes earlier, he had spoken to Victoria Hale with polished superiority, convinced he controlled the room. Now he looked like a man watching the ground collapse beneath his own career. "Mr. Hale," Ethan said finally, his voice weaker than before, "please allow me the opportunity to formally apologize to your wife." Jonathan looked at him calmly. "You had that opportunity before you humiliated her." Ethan swallowed hard. The words struck deeper because they were true. Victoria remained quiet beside her husband, still holding the worn leather folder against her chest. But now the same people who had stared at her with judgment moments earlier looked at her completely differently. A woman wearing a designer coat lowered her eyes in embarrassment. One older client quietly removed his glasses and shook his head toward Ethan with visible disgust. Respect had arrived too late. A senior executive named Richard Bennett rushed across the lobby from the private offices, breathing heavily beneath his expensive gray suit. "Jonathan," he said quickly, forcing a nervous smile, "surely this situation does not require such drastic measures." Jonathan turned slightly toward him. "You are?" "Richard Bennett, Regional Vice President." Jonathan nodded faintly. "Then perhaps you should ask your branch manager why your institution publicly accused my wife of fraud after verifying her documents." Richard's expression immediately tightened. He looked toward Melissa, who reluctantly nodded confirmation. The color faded from Richard's face almost instantly. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "this behavior does not reflect Sterling National's values." Jonathan's gaze drifted slowly across the lobby again, It reflected them quite clearly 10 minutes ago. The room fell silent once more. Ethan lowered his head slightly now, no longer able to maintain eye contact with anyone around him. Pride had abandoned him completely. But Jonathan still was not angry in the way people expected powerful men to become angry. He never raised his voice, never insulted anyone. That quiet control somehow made every word feel heavier. "Do you know what bothers me most?" Jonathan asked calmly. Nobody answered. Victoria spends most of her life helping children whose families cannot afford proper schools, medical support, or transportation. She chooses simplicity because she believes dignity should never depend on money. He glanced briefly toward his wife before continuing. "And yet the moment she walked into this bank dressed like an ordinary person, your employees treated her like she was beneath basic respect." Melissa looked down, ashamed now not only for Ethan, but for everyone who had stayed silent while it happened. Richard Bennett rubbed one trembling hand across his forehead. "We will conduct a full internal review immediately," he promised. Jonathan's expression remained unreadable. An internal review does not undo public humiliation. Nearby clients listened in complete silence. Some nodded quietly in agreement. Others stared at Victoria with growing guilt, realizing how quickly they too had judged her the moment she entered the bank. Ethan finally spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Hale, I truly am sorry." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Her voice, when she finally answered, remained soft. "You were not sorry when you thought I had no power." Ethan closed his eyes briefly because there was nothing he could say against the truth. And throughout Sterling National Bank, employees watched the collapse of a man who had spent his entire career believing appearances mattered more than character. Richard Bennett immediately pulled Ethan Carlisle aside near the private banking offices, while the entire lobby watched the collapse unfold in stunned silence. The regional vice president no longer looked concerned about customer relations or public appearances. He looked terrified. Sterling National Bank had spent years competing aggressively for Hale Capital's business, offering exclusive investment structures, private wealth incentives, and executive partnerships just to maintain access to Jonathan Hale's accounts. Losing $400 million in a single morning would not simply damage quarterly reports. It would shake confidence throughout the entire institution. Ethan stood pale and speechless as Richard whispered sharply in his ear. Across the lobby, employees continued answering frantic calls, while computer alerts flashed across internal systems, confirming active transfer requests. The reality was becoming impossible to contain. Jonathan Hale had not made an emotional threat. He had already begun dismantling Sterling National's relationship with his companies in real time. Victoria quietly watched the chaos unfolding around them, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. That was what unsettled several people most. She was not enjoying Ethan's humiliation. She simply looked tired. Tired of people assuming kindness meant weakness. Tired of watching strangers decide someone's value based on clothing instead of character. A young teller finally stepped away from her station and approached Victoria carefully. "Mrs. Hale," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I am sorry for how you were treated." Victoria offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." Nearby, another employee lowered her eyes in embarrassment after overhearing the exchange. One by one, the atmosphere inside Sterling National began shifting from fear to shame. Richard Bennett returned moments later, forcing professionalism back into his strained expression. "Mr. Hale," he said cautiously, "our executive board would like the opportunity to speak with you directly before any final decisions are made." Jonathan glanced briefly toward Victoria before answering. "Why?" Richard hesitated. "Because Sterling National values your partnership." Jonathan's expression hardened slightly. "Your institution should have valued basic human respect first." The words landed heavily throughout the lobby again. Ethan remained silent near the private offices, unable to even look toward Victoria anymore. The arrogance that once defined him had completely disappeared, replaced by the hollow realization that he had destroyed his own career over prejudice disguised as professionalism. Jonathan slowly turned toward the clients still gathered throughout the lobby. Some looked deeply uncomfortable now, especially those who had silently watched the humiliation earlier without intervening. "Do you know something interesting?" Jonathan said calmly. "Victoria has access to more wealth than most people inside this building combined." Several eyes widened immediately, and yet she still shops at discount bookstores, drives a 7-year-old SUV, and spends most weekends reviewing scholarship applications for children she will never meet. Victoria lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Jonathan's voice softened as he looked at her. "Because she understands something many wealthy people never learn. Dignity is not something money buys." A hush fell again. Even Richard Bennett looked unable to respond. Jonathan then faced Ethan directly one final time. "You saw a woman dressed simply and assumed she lacked value," he said quietly. "That tells me far more about your character than hers." Ethan's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the sentence. Somewhere near the back offices, another employee hurried past carrying printed transfer confirmations, while executives argued quietly behind glass conference room walls. Sterling National was already entering crisis management mode. But none of the emergency meetings, legal reviews, or corporate apologies would erase what had happened in that marble lobby. Because the damage was no longer financial alone. The bank had exposed something uglier than poor judgment. It had exposed the kind of arrogance that mistakes wealth for superiority. And everyone who witnessed it would remember exactly how quickly that illusion collapsed. Nearly 40 minutes after Victoria Hale first walked through the doors of Sterling National Bank, the marble lobby no longer resembled the polished institution that had once projected untouchable confidence. Executives moved quickly between conference rooms behind glass walls, while phones rang nonstop throughout the private banking department. Employees whispered anxiously beside computer screens, displaying transfer notices that continued appearing one after another. $400 million was already leaving the institution, and everyone inside the building understood the consequences would travel far beyond a single branch in downtown Chicago. Jonathan stood quietly beside Victoria near the front counter, while Richard Bennett continued making frantic calls several feet away. Ethan Carlisle remained near the private offices, completely isolated now. None of the employees who once admired his authority seemed willing to stand beside him anymore. The silence surrounding him felt colder than punishment itself. Victoria slowly looked around the lobby one final time. Earlier that morning, she had entered the bank carrying nothing except a folder and the hope of helping expand scholarship programs for children across the Midwest. Instead, she had been publicly humiliated for looking too ordinary. The irony settled heavily across the room now that everyone understood exactly who she was. A young mother seated near the waiting area quietly approached Victoria, holding the hand of her little daughter. "Excuse me," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you." Victoria looked surprised. The woman smiled gently. "My son received one of your foundation scholarships last year." Victoria's expression softened instantly. "What school?" "St. Andrew's Academy in Milwaukee," the woman replied. "We never would have afforded it without your help." For the first time since entering Sterling National, Victoria genuinely smiled. "How is he doing?" "Top of his class," the mother answered proudly. Nearby clients overheard the conversation, and the reality of everything became even harder to ignore. The woman Ethan Carlisle had treated like an inconvenience had quietly changed thousands of lives while expecting nothing in return. Jonathan watched his wife with quiet admiration before turning back toward Richard Bennett, who had just ended another tense phone call. "Mr. Hale," Richard said carefully, "the executive board would like to offer a formal public apology to Mrs. Hale and discuss immediate corrective actions." Jonathan looked at Victoria instead of answering for her. She remained silent for several seconds before speaking softly. "An apology matters less than change." Richard nodded quickly. "Of course." Victoria glanced toward Ethan, who still stood frozen near the private offices, unable to meet her eyes. People should not have to prove their wealth before receiving basic respect, she said quietly. The words spread through the lobby like truth finally spoken out loud. Several employees lowered their heads in shame. One older client removed his hat respectfully as Victoria passed nearby. Jonathan gently took the leather folder from his wife's hands and rested one arm around her shoulders. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked softly. Victoria nodded. Together, they walked toward the massive glass entrance while the entire bank watched in silence. Nobody tried stopping them this time. Nobody questioned whether they belonged. The revolving doors slowly turned as sunlight spilled across the marble floor behind them. Outside, the black sedan waited quietly at the curb beneath the cold Chicago morning sky. Jonathan opened the door for Victoria, and before stepping inside, she glanced back once toward Sterling National Bank. Not with anger, not with triumph, just disappointment. Because the greatest lesson that morning had never been about money leaving a bank. It had been about the cost of losing humanity in the pursuit of status. And as the car disappeared into the busy downtown traffic, the people standing inside Sterling National were left with a silence none of them would forget. A silence that reminded every person watching that true wealth is revealed not by what someone owns, but by how they choose to treat those who appear to have nothing at all.